some of NATO's largest economies, some of our richest countries still seem to think the era of free riding is here. That was the United States Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, if you prefer, speaking at a meeting of NATO defense ministers this June. Hegseth's criticism was harsh. It was well in line with what America's president has been saying since the campaign trail, and if any NATO allies are still somehow thinking that Trump and Hegseth's stance on Europe was mere bluster, well, hopefully they've woken up. Over the span of the last month, the world has finally gotten a clear picture of the forces that the US intends to withdraw in the coming months, and the prognosis is very, very bad for European defense. Europe is rearming, European militaries are shaking off the cobwebs, but America is moving so fast and planning to withdraw so much that Europe is at risk of being left behind. Not to worry, of course, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is here to save the day, and if he catches you grousing about him, then he's going to call Donald Trump Daddy again, or something. Look, our WarFronts team has been watching Europe's rearmament for a while now, and we aren't exactly buoyed with optimism when Mark Rutte comes around and says everything's going to be okay. According to Rutte, however, the NATO nations of Europe have already committed to filling the shortfalls and capability gaps that America's going to leave behind. NATO will remain unified, and its eastward flank against Russia will be as strong as it was when Uncle Sam was around to hold the line. So rather than just give in to our cynicism, let's take a close look at that claim and answer a few key questions. What is America withdrawing? What can Europe do to replace it? And will it be enough? 2026 has been a year of bad news for the NATO alliance, and especially for European nations that have long depended on American security guarantees. Amidst Washington's disastrous war with Iran, the Pentagon told its European allies to expect significant delays in the shipment of much-needed weapon systems, especially air defenses, that were already bought and paid for. In early May, Trump announced that the US was pulling about 5,000 troops out of Germany, following a diplomatic dust-up in which German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that America had been, quote, humiliated by Iran. No points for being right, we guess. But when asked about the drawdown at the time, Trump confirmed, quote, we're going to cut way down, and we're cutting a lot further than 5,000. Not long after, the US cancelled the deployment of an important armoured brigade to Poland before reversing course, but giving rather vague reassurances that Polish leaders really promise won't result in any of the security gaps that currently seem likely. But the real meat of America's forthcoming defense cuts were first revealed in early June when a German outlet called Die Welt learned of plans to drastically draw down America's aerial and naval presence in the European theatre. As of the time of writing, the US hasn't made the specifics of that plan public, so we're going to rely on a report by the New York Times, drawing on excerpts of the documents that it's been able to review, along with interviews with unnamed European security officials who've been informed about the plan's contents. And in a word, it's bad. I guess that's 2 words, or maybe 3 words if you count the contraction, but hey-ho. According to the Times, the US plans to reduce the number of forward-deployed F-16 Viper and F-15E Strike Eagle fighter jets by around 1/3, taking them from a current deployment of about 150 aircraft in total down to roughly 100. The US will recall an entire carrier strike group, including the aircraft carrier that leads it, and all of the warships associated, plus the dozens of combat aircraft the carrier transports on board. Washington will also withdraw at least 1 missile-launching submarine, along with about 2 of every 5 maritime reconnaissance aircraft, bringing the count from 26 aircraft stationed in Europe today down to about 15. But the final cuts are the worst ones of all. The US will reallocate 1 of 2 groups of bombers previously assigned for European defense, as well as all 8 aerial refueling aircraft that the US currently makes available to Europe. When asked by the Times about the plan, the Pentagon declined to comment, instead choosing to refer reporters to its own recent statements about a general desire to draw down American troop deployments on the continent. But judging by the reactions of European leaders, this plan is very real, and even if some of the numbers don't end up being exactly right, the scale of the plan's withdrawal is described accurately. According to NATO diplomats speaking to Reuters, the US has already informed its European allies of the decision behind closed doors, and while the Pentagon hasn't yet announced a precise timeline, it's expressed that the withdrawal process will basically start immediately. Now, we're going to evaluate the whole Rutte to the rescue situation in a moment. The claim that this withdrawal is a problem Europe can solve quickly and completely. But before we evaluate that claim, we have to understand just how massive a problem this really is. Each of the units that America is talking about withdrawing or downsizing is critically important to European defense, and it's especially important that those assets are oriented toward Europe's eastern flank. We're not going to get too deep into the continuing threat posed by Russia to the NATO alliance, but for now, we'll just refer you to the recent wave of concern across Europe that Russia could attempt an invasion of NATO member Latvia to try and fracture the alliance outright. We'll also throw in a recent statement by Germany's Minister of Defense Boris Pistorius, who warned in late May that, quote, all 32 NATO partners agree that Russia could have the ability to invade a NATO partner country in 2029, end quote. If Russia were to attempt an invasion, the capabilities the US might withdraw are some of the ones that would be most effective against Russia's particular style of invasion. American F-15E fighters are basically weapons trucks, utterly unstealthy when they fly, but capable of carrying ungodly amounts of munitions to devastate advancing tank columns. The F-16 is excellent at dealing with enemy air power, and it's a highly capable interceptor used in Ukraine and recently by several NATO countries to track and destroy incoming drones and missiles before they can make impact. America's maritime reconnaissance aircraft are vital in identifying and sniffing out submarines, which could be used to sink surface warships or even threaten a nuclear launch, while also identifying the smaller and hybrid assets Russia could use to lay mines, cut undersea cables, and otherwise sow chaos across Europe. America's Carrier Strike Group would offer unparalleled naval firepower at a time when most European navies only operate frigates, and some European aircraft carriers, particularly Britain's, are nowhere near ready to fill in the gap. America's strategic bomber fleet is extremely important to the NATO alliance, where no other alliance member has a strategic bomber in its arsenal, and where American bombers are a critical, long-range deterrent against Russia using either conventional or nuclear weapons. Finally, even though it might sound mundane, air-to-air refueling is a critical logistical asset that allows combat aircraft to keep flying or conduct missions at longer range. Europe is badly behind on air-to-air refuelers, and that's partly by design, seeing as the United States has so many of these aircraft and previously had no problem allotting 8 of them to help its NATO partners. Remove all of those American assets at once, and NATO is facing a serious security gap. But before we discuss just how bad the problem might be, we'd like to take a moment to tell you about Fronts.co. Fronts is our increasingly professional outlet for those of you who like what we do here on the main channel, but wish it could be more in-depth, or just a bit nerdier. Every week we publish 2 videos narrated by yours truly, diving into the lesser-known conflicts shaping our world. We also publish 3 long-form written pieces by actual experts on conflicts from Ukraine to Sudan, from Iran to Mali, and more. If you're getting something out of today's episode, you could check out recent expert articles on how Europe can defend itself against Russian aggression and how Europe's push for conscription creates mass but fails to create muscle. For all your Middle East needs, you can check out our free-to-access Middle East Roundtable podcast with our writing team. And while you're on the site, check out our recent 80-minute deep dive on how North Korea sees the rest of the world. A subscription costs $5 a month or $50 a year. That's again Fronts.co. Check it out if you like what we do here on the main channel. And now, let's get back to Europe. The shortfalls. Okay, so let's circle back to the man we might describe as not exactly the villain of this episode, but one of its most controversial characters, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Once these reports on US withdrawals began to circulate publicly, Rutte took to his podium in Brussels to try and soothe the emerging panic. We'll quote Rutte's response directly. What we're working on is to make sure that what the US has been providing so far will be filled. Most of, and a lot of it, done. Some of it nearly, and some of it requiring more debates and discussions. End quote. According to Rutte, European NATO members, plus Canada, have shown that they're, quote, ready, willing, and able to do more. Of course, if you're a defense nerd like us here at WarFronts, and you've taken even the quickest look at the state of European defense right now, you would be well within your rights to believe that Europe is neither ready nor willing, nor able to do more, as Rutte described. Among the issues that have rightfully raised the blood pressure of NATO defense ministers in recent months is the damning resignation of British Defense Secretary John Healey, who quit his post after the Starmer government refused to set a clear roadmap for Britain to meet its new defense spending expectations and introduced a defense budget that would actually cut spending in the long term. Meanwhile, Russian drones continue to intrude into NATO member airspace, including one instance in late May where a Russian drone impacted a Romanian apartment block. Just recently, a Russian warship was firing warning shots at a civilian yacht in the English Channel around the same time that suspected assassins shot a Russian dissident artist dead outside his house in Poland. The joint Franco-German program to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet, the FCAS, has gone up in smoke, and European leaders and defense experts still fear that Russia could attack Latvia, the island of Gotland, the Arctic territory of Svalbard, or another NATO target much sooner than previously anticipated. But according to Reuters, European allies are stepping up anyhow, and speaking anonymously to Politico in Europe, several defense sources and diplomats have confirmed the same. According to a Politico report published on the 17th of June, one diplomat explained, quoting, "Allies will commit their new offers by the beginning of July with immediate activation. So, if adequate offers are made, there will be no gap whatsoever." End quote. Another diplomat said, "European allies have started to deliver." End quote. Now, some of the alliance's new allocations will be direct substitutes, basically swapping out an American unit or system with a direct European equivalent. Others will be a bit more complicated, and specific details on that front are not yet forthcoming. But although we can and will speculate on the ways that NATO could use this as an opportunity to rethink its defense, we'll begin with the one-to-one replacements that NATO might be considering. On combat aircraft, the easiest warplane to replace directly is the F-16. Although many European air forces have either retired their F-16 fleets or fly older models, several countries have either bought new Viper models or upgraded their older warplanes. That includes more than 80 that will be upgraded by 2027 in Greece, and more than a dozen newly ordered from Slovakia, among others. Better yet, 2 European-made warplanes are able to offer basically comparable services, the Eurofighter and the French Rafale, with several hundred copies in various European arsenals. Sweden's Saab Gripen creates a lighter payload but beats the F-16 in range and ruggedness, and could really use a moment to shine in an active interceptor role on NATO's behalf. The F-15E will pose a greater challenge. No European fighter can match the aircraft in both range and payload capacity, except the elderly Tornado, which is slowly being retired from the small handful of European arsenals where it's flown in the past. That's a particular problem for the nations of NATO, since the F-15E was perhaps the alliance's greatest tactical deterrent against the massed armor attacks that Russia preferred before it had to rethink its fighting strategy in Ukraine. In an invasion of a NATO member, Russia could conceivably return to that style of advance, knowing that NATO hasn't yet implemented the drone-heavy tactics that have made Ukraine's battlefields inhospitable to heavy armor on either side. Europe can, of course, compensate with other aircraft, but a direct one-to-one comparison is harder to find. In both cases, Europe faces another problem: aircraft sourcing. Because European defense is the responsibility of multiple dozens of militaries working together, and because those militaries combined don't have as many combat aircraft available as the United States, European militaries don't have nearly the level of flexibility that Washington does. Each military individually flies a much smaller overall number of aircraft, with those numbers further reduced by maintenance needs, readiness issues, and homeland defense responsibilities. And because the United States was acting as the continent's security guarantor, these air forces are not designed to have a bunch of additional fighters available. As a result, European defense ministries will have to be somewhat creative in identifying air power that can basically be donated to the NATO alliance and distributing responsibility with other countries without compromising their effectiveness. For similar reasons, Europe just doesn't possess strategic bombers, and so one-to-one substitution just is not possible. Then there's the naval element, where the United States' decision to withdraw a carrier strike group will present major problems for NATO forces. European militaries do possess aircraft carriers. The UK has 2, Italy has 1, France has 1, and Spain has an amphibious assault ship that can fly limited numbers of F-35s. As we've already alluded to, however, Britain's carriers are in constant shambles between their mechanical issues, their lack of other surface warships to sail alongside them, and their very limited air complement. Italy suffers from a shortage of F-35s, and because Italy and France only have a single carrier each, they can expect to have those carriers in port for maintenance, crew rotation, and other needs that take them out of service. Not only that, but these are national assets, not collective ones. They're deeply important to the French and Italian militaries respectively, and neither government is likely to be eager to basically give them up to satisfy the needs of the European continent. Europe's available heavy warships suffer from similar problems: low overall number of ships, crew shortages, readiness issues, and the fact that each of them sails as part of a national navy with its own sovereign defense priorities. The United States has carrier strike groups to spare, but it's the only nation on Earth with that option at its disposal. And finally, there's Europe's air-to-air refueler problem. In total, the continent only possesses about 55 dedicated aerial tankers, plus just under 100 transport aircraft that can be modified to fill the role. That's compared to the roughly 600 aerial refuelers at America's disposal, together comprising more than 2/3 of the global refueling fleet. The NATO alliance possesses a shared, jointly owned fleet of 12 refuelers, with 9 currently in the alliance's possession, and the others still on the way. But even so, that means Europe is operating on a very thin margin. Readiness rates and national concerns within individual European air forces rear their ugly heads again, and the problem is made worse by the fact that the European refueler fleet isn't fully interoperable. Altogether, Europe's aerial tanker problem is critical, and the United States does understand that, but clearly it doesn't matter. Even worse, these platforms should be force multipliers for their respective militaries, allowing combat jets to stay airborne far longer because they can constantly be sipping on fuel as they patrol or fly into contested airspace. If there aren't enough refuelers, however, then they constrain the entire combat air fleet they need to support. Europe possesses the fighter jets and the combat capabilities required to dominate airspace in the event of a confrontation with Russia, even without direct US assistance. But without adequate refueling support, Europe loses the air war simply because it can't keep its assets flying. Nor are any of these easy problems to solve. European nations are ordering more combat aircraft and more refuelers, but these take a really long time to build and deliver. The problem's even worse for naval vessels, especially the massive surface combatants and aerial carriers that these nations would need. The economics of the situation are working against Europe too. France, for example, is struggling to avoid a full-on debt crisis. Britain only just refused to adequately fund its military. Italy faces a crippling perpetual debt crisis, and Spain, as we mentioned earlier, has no interest in spending any more than the bare minimum on defense. Finally, Washington's practically immediate timeline works against European interests and American ones. Europe is more than capable of handling this share of continental defense if the continent has enough time to get the transition right. But Washington is in such a rush that Europe's options are to make do with less and overextend itself in the process, or otherwise to leave a strategic gap during a critical, dangerous few years. Unfortunately for the NATO alliance, there are no easy answers within the timeline that Washington hopes to impose, but there are compromises Europe can make and stopgap measures that the continent can adopt to minimize the damage to Europe's strategic situation. Step 1 is relatively straightforward. European countries must take another hard look at their militaries, decide what they actually need to protect homelands that are already very secure, and identify the spare capacity available to help fill in the gap. According to Mark Rutte, that process is already underway, although Europe has yet to reveal any of its chosen solutions as of the time of writing. Then the continent can set about finding solutions that maintain as much deterrent power as possible without relying on capabilities that Europe can't provide by itself. Take refueling aircraft, for example. Europe really doesn't have the refuelers to spare, but it does have an easier time finding multi-role fighter aircraft. So, to compensate, Europe can station those combat aircraft much closer to the front and expand air bases in Finland, Poland, or the Baltics. That in turn will introduce new problems. Those forward bases will be more vulnerable to missiles and drones, which will, in turn, put a target on the large fuel tanks that those bases require. But the way to avoid those problems entirely would have been to build a stronger European refueler fleet, and that opportunity has been lost. The refueler capacity that Europe does have can be leveraged to support one of its greatest assets in the sky: stealth aircraft. While Europe's American-made F-35s will still be somewhat range-limited since they have to depend on refuelers that can't hide in contested airspace, the combination of stealth, extended range, and flight time makes the most of the capacity Europe does possess. On the issue of naval power, Europe can make up some of the gap from America's lost carrier strike group without providing a direct equivalent. Europe doesn't sail very many proper destroyers, but the continent has somewhere around 130 active naval frigates, creating a much larger pool of ships to fill a somewhat different role. Organized into naval task groups in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the High North, those European ships wouldn't be able to provide the same kind of deterrent that a carrier strike group could, but they can be in many more places at once, fighting with tactics that are less centralized and less dependent on the capabilities of a single lead ship. They won't operate with comparable air support in the open ocean, but most of the time, they won't have to operate that far into the ocean in the first place. Relying on land-based assets from NATO member territory, those ships can offer some of the same deep strike capabilities, the same blockade and interdiction capabilities, and other vital deterrent tools in the areas that matter most to Europe. Finally, Europe's strategic setback does still create a new, potent opportunity for the continent to embrace some of the lessons of Ukraine-style modern warfare sooner than it otherwise might have. The strategic deterrence that the US plans to withdraw from Europe is certainly significant, but it's also, shall we say, very traditional. The US deployed a carrier strike group, a submarine, fighter and bomber aircraft, and of course tens of thousands of ground troops to fight a conventional Cold War-style engagement on air, land, and sea. But as Ukraine and other global conflicts have demonstrated, that's not really the world we live in anymore. Europe's ultimate goal isn't to replace American capabilities exactly, just to prove that it can. Europe's ultimate goal is to deter Russia in an era of warfare defined by attritional tactics, long-range missile and drone warfare, and stagnant positional front lines where engagements are decided by FPV drones. That's a space where Europe might be more able to compete. It's not that Europe is particularly good at this style of warfare right now. In fact, as recent war games have demonstrated, Europe remains pretty bad at it. But the continent is in a position to figure out how to cover new security gaps, and to do that, Europe will have to develop new capabilities of some kind. That part isn't optional. The only thing that Europe gets to choose is the specific tools it'll employ to solve the problem. But drones, missiles, and other attritional tools are a more cost-effective place to invest euros, and they're easier products to learn how to build on European production lines, especially with help from Ukraine. A single new F-16V would cost a European customer somewhere around $70 million just on the flyaway price tag. But if, instead of buying that single aircraft, a European nation were to build a production line for, let's say, Ukrainian Flamingo cruise missiles, then that European nation could purchase 140 of them for the same price. It's a far less dynamic system, it only has one job, but that job is to deter Russia, and Russia is deterred far more effectively with 140 cruise missiles than with a single F-16, especially if Europe doesn't have the refuelers to keep that F-16 in the sky. That's just a single example, but the same logic holds across every area of deterrence that Europe now has to address. Europe's primary goal, really its only goal, is to convince Russia that attacking the NATO alliance is a bad idea. To accomplish that task, Europe can either wait a decade to sail a couple of new destroyers, or it can build thousands upon thousands of surface and underwater sea drones capable of laying waste to Russian ports in the Baltic and Black Seas. To threaten the exclave of Kaliningrad, Europe can purchase dozens of new strike aircraft, or at a price of just $5,000 per unit, Europe can invest in tens or hundreds of thousands of Hornet drones, the same ones that Ukraine has used to devastate Russian supply lines at medium range. Instead of trying to build a strategic bomber of its own, Europe can examine the ample data from Kyiv on how to oversaturate and break through Russian air defenses with unmanned systems, and it can develop a far more sophisticated, far more overwhelming version of that same set of capabilities. In the near term, Washington's decision to withdraw such a high share of its forces will be a real setback for the NATO alliance. But despite all of Europe's qualms about the way Washington goes about this sort of thing, it's hard to deny, in retrospect, that giving Europe a kick in the pants has been working out okay. This time, Washington's latest pressure campaign could be more of the same, another situation where Europe has to figure out how to handle its defense without help. But Europe has the opportunity to do something more, and to make this the moment to start implementing lessons from a devastating war on the continent's doorstep. Thank you for watching.